Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget Lawson. I am the Assistant Director of Chapters for the Western Region in DC. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows our virtual national convention is June 7th through the 11th and is free to register unless you are seeking CLE credit. You can find out more about our convention at acslaw.org/convention. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's panel, What You Need to Know About Postgraduate Fellowships. Our moderator is Aparna Gupta, the Associate Director of Professional Development and External Relations at Pepperdine University Caruso School of Law. Without further ado, take it away.
Thanks so much, Bridget, and thanks to all of our panelists and students for joining us for this exciting ACS career talk. As a former Equal Justice Works Fellow back in the day, I was pleased to moderate this discussion with the future of law students who are going to be going out in the field. I want to give a small background of what postgraduate fellows and fellowships are about, and then have our panelists sort of take it from there. For those of you that don't know what postgraduate fellowships are, they are generally a 1 or 2 year term opportunity that generally funds public interest law graduates to go into generally an underfunded nonprofit or social justice organization to embark on either a specific project that the organization likely does not have the funding to execute on their own, or they go in and assist the organization in expanding something that the organization is already engaged in. So by adding capacity to that nonprofit or social justice organization. The application process, we'll get into this in a little bit, is lengthy. And so I'm excited that you're here and joining the discussion and at least beginning to think about it. I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists today. I'm going to quickly just share their name and sort of their fellowship and sort of where they're going to be pursuing their work, but I'd really like for them to talk about what their project is like. We'll begin the discussion there and then get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. So our first panelist is Jenny Choi, who's going to be a Justice Catalyst Fellow, who will be working in Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office in Washington, D.C. We also have Ramis Wadood, who is going to be a Skadden Fellow at the ACLU of Michigan in Detroit. And we also have Christina Beeler, who just completed an Equal Justice Works Fellowship at the Justice and Children's Advocacy Project in Houston. And so, Jenny, I'd love to start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and also sort of what you're going to be doing in your fellowship?
Sure. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, ACS, for putting this together. I'm Jenny Choi. I just graduated from law school. And next year, as Aparna said, I'll be doing a Justice Catalyst Fellowship at the New York Queens District Office of Representative Ocasio-Cortez. So my project is really about bringing immigration policy making back to the district office. So oftentimes there is this like Hill versus district office divide between who gets to do policy and who does the casework. And my thought was, looking at the demographics of the 14th Congressional District, which is the district that she represents, it doesn't really make sense to have that sort of clear divide between the staff doing the casework and the staff doing the policymaking. So the idea for this project is, the big picture idea is to bring policymaking back into the district office, but the desired kind of work product from the year is basically using that kind of collaborative loop with casework and also direct community engagement from the district office to basically fill in the substance of some of the taglines that have kind of caught fire over the past couple of years, like abolish ICE, defund DHS, to fill in the substance there, because that's has not been really done yet in a way that kind of informs casual conversations about what should happen to immigration policy. So that is my project, and I look forward to answering your questions and to the rest of the panel.
Wonderful. Ramis, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Ramis. I go to school, or went to school with Jenny. We both graduated last week. Thank you also to the ACS folks for organizing this panel. I know, even a year ago, there weren't many resources for us jumping into the fellowship season. So now that the fellowship season pretty much begun now that we're in the summer. I appreciate the fact that the ACS is doing this and that more and more of these are popping up. So I'm doing a Skadden Fellowship, so a 2-year fellowship through the Skadden Foundation with the ACLU of Michigan back here in Detroit. My project is focused on kind of a set of litigation and policy advocacy surrounding abusive police practices in immigrant neighborhoods in the Detroit area and Michigan in general. The idea being to highlight abusive police practices and cooperation between local and federal police agencies in order to kind of generate a statewide conversation about kind of the excessive role of police and over-policing in immigrant neighborhoods.
Wonderful. And Christina, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you did as part of your EJW fellowship?
Yeah, so I completed my EJW fellowship last August. So mine was from 2018 to 2020. And I represented students in school disciplinary proceedings. So I created a program aimed at disrupting the school to prison pipeline here in Houston and represented K through 12 kids in various proceedings whenever they were facing suspension or expulsion or in-school suspension or other varieties of punitive discipline. So that was what my project was focused on.
Wonderful. It would be helpful to learn from each of you, and we can sort of just follow this order and, feel free to jump in. When did you first hear about postgraduate fellowships? Was it your 1L year, or was it, just your 2L summer? And how did you hear about the particular fellowships for which you applied?
Sure. I think I found out about public interest fellowships when I was doing my 1L summer. So I worked at the Campaign Legal Center, which usually hosts a couple of post-grad public interest fellows. So that's when I found out about their existence and the types of fellowships that exist. Mm-hmm.
Ramis or Christina?
I think I found out about it the same way, that there was a fellow. I interned for the ACLU of Michigan my first summer, which is where I'm going back to. And so, I was lucky enough to interact with a fellow they had during that summer. I'm also lucky enough to, 2 of my clinic supervisors were former Skadden fellows, and so I had kind of heard about the the fellowship process early on, but never really like internalized it and looked into it until it was almost too late to really understand fellowships. So I was lucky enough to have that early interaction.
Great.
Yeah, so I found out about it actually from ACS. Peggy Lee, who is on staff at ACS and is amazing. I talked to her when I was first getting involved with ACS as a 1L, and I said, hey, I came to law school specifically to focus on the school to prison pipeline, and this is what I want to do, but I don't see any organizations doing this. Is this possible? What do you think? And she sat me down and walked me through the fellowship process and told me about Equal Justice Works and Skadden and a variety of other fellowships, and guided me the entire way. I mean, even when I applied for EJW and I got my first interview, she helped me prep for my interview. So ACS was very integral in me finding my fellowship and in applying to fellowships and even knowing about it at all.
Great. And Ramis, your path was a little bit more clear because you interned at the ACLU your 1L summer, which is actually what I did as well. I interned at the Asian American Legal Defense Fund my 1L summer, and then realized I really wanted to continue working with them. And they had some fellows also who were able to nurture and mentor. But Jenny, how did you come across this particular opportunity? Because I think what can be challenging for students as 2Ls and 3Ls and even recent grads, because there are some fellowships that take folks that are 1 or 2 years out of college, or out of law school, or if you're coming off a clerkship. So how do you find that fellowship organization or that opportunity? So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you found that position.
Sure. So I, like Ramis said, I think I also didn't really start thinking about this until it was almost too late. And I think one of the reasons was that I had applied for clerkships in the summers of 2L, so in June, I think, and I didn't know what years I would get hired for. So I didn't start thinking about things until I got hired, and then I had a clearer sense of how many years I might have to do something that I want to do before I start clerking. So when I found out that I had a year to pursue a project, it was, I think, too late for most of the fellowship deadlines. And then I started to think about, where I wanted to be geographically and what kind of work I wanted to do at that location. And I think I came to the sense that if I was going to be doing litigation down the road anyway, I would really love to take this year to do something else. So I started looking for opportunities in the policy space, and I knew that I wanted to be in New York and wanted to work on either immigration or voting rights. So I started to reach out to a bunch of offices with this vision of trying to do policy from the district office as opposed to the Hill office. And I also was in touch with a bunch of state representatives as well. So I was looking both state and federal, and had a great conversation with a contact that I got in touch with at AOC's office, which turned into a couple of conversations, and we built the project together. They were the ones who told me that their need was in immigration. Started to talk to more of their staff members, the member herself, and then also, I think, community partners that they usually work with to develop policy in this area. So the building the project was really a collaborative process. And I think that's one of the most important things I learned from the entire kind of experience of going through this process.
Christina, how did you find your organization, and how did you build your project with them?
Yeah, so the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project is a clinic at the University of Houston Law Center, and one of my professors co-founded the clinic. And when I talked to Peggy about this, she said, go talk to your professors. Honestly, you never know who will have an idea about where you could do this work. And I went to his office and I told him what I envisioned. And he said, why don't you do it at my organization? You can apply here with JCAP. And I think that's something that a lot of people who are looking for fellowships maybe don't think about, is like that you can do them at the clinic at your law school, and that you can go talk to professors you've already formed relationships with and tell them what you're thinking about. Because I have a number of friends now who I have seen do these fellowships at their clinics at their law school. So, and we developed the project together. I went in with my idea, but he sat down with me, and the other co-founder sat down with me, and we, talked through all the challenges that we might face, and things that I should be able to address in an interview and in the application. And so it was also very collaborative, like Jenny said, with my organization. But I did find them just at my law school by going around and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. Who has an idea of who could host me?
Wonderful. And I think one of the things that students may not know is in the more traditional fellowships, so EJW, Skadden, Soros, that have been around for decades now, sometimes organizations that have funded quite a few fellows have an internal competitive process in and of itself to select who they will be sponsoring for a Skadden or an EJW. It's very rare that organizations will put up two people because the chances of them getting it, you would split that 50-50, or you're having the funder then decide what kind of work the organization should be doing. And so just to be mindful, in Christina's case, where there was a clinic and she had a willing mentor who was ready to sort of select her and move forward, you can start a little bit later. But for more sort of traditional, I would just say, like the ACLU or even ALDEF, and I'm sure LDF also has some sort of internal process by which they figure out, okay, these are the fellows we're going to put forth for these particular applications. And those deadlines sort of start a little earlier. So they start in like June or July of your 2L summer. So just to be mindful that if you're considering this, now would be a good time to talk to your summer supervisors. I know you just started, many of you, your summer jobs, but just to even have a coffee or a Zoom saying, I'm considering this, what's the process like internally to move forward on this? I was hoping we learned a little bit from Jenny about sort of what her fellowship process was. Ramis, could you talk a little bit about sort of what the application process was in terms of figuring out that you're going to be with the ACLU of Michigan to like hitting submit on the Skadden button. What was that process like for you?
Sure. So the process began for me sometime around June, where my old supervisor at the ACLU of Michigan texted me and was, kind of like, oh, hoping to see your application come in on Monday. And I was like, what is on Monday? And it turns out that the deadline for fellowship applications, like Aparna mentioned, for some organizations, they have kind of this initial like application process. And turns out like, I wasn't even aware that the fellowship posting was online and that it had been up for a month and all that, which is, again, an emphasis that things for some organizations start right around now. And so, I think it was June 20th or something that I got this text, and I asked for a little bit more time to submit my application, and I submitted it. And I think it wasn't until the beginning of August that I went through that process and got out of it successfully. And the ACLU of Michigan and I decided to move forward into fellowships together. So that was about a month-long process, your classic like, internship / job interview type process. So I considered that first part actually getting the job, and then the second part getting the funding, so applying to fellowships. And so, I spent the month of August and part of September drafting my Skadden and Equal Justice Works fellowship applications. And that was, incredibly collaborative. We talked almost every day, exchanging drafts, hopping on the phone to exchange ideas. And I would definitely, recommend approaching it that way. I had friends who talked to their fellowship folks at their organization once every other week, checking in, sending drafts. But I was, again, like lucky enough to have a good enough relationship with these folks that I could text one of them, call another one of them, email a whole group of them, and really have a daily conversation. So it was a huge lift as far as writing all of this stuff up and making sure that it fits all the different fellowship organizations requirements. But ultimately, I feel like the application we submitted to Skadden and to EJW in the middle of September was the product of like some really, really close collaboration and some really good conversations.
Awesome. And Christina, was your process similar to Ramis's process in terms of EJW?
It was similar in that the application took a long time to put together. Yes. So although, as we've already mentioned, I didn't have to apply internally and get selected there, the application process was very lengthy. So I would say I spent about 3 or 4 weeks just obsessing over that application. I did have a little bit less guidance. I did have a mentor sit down with me and my professor sit down with me a couple times, but it was more like me checking in every week or so, and then just eating, sleeping, breathing that application. So it was something where like literally I was dreaming about challenges and how to face them. And, at 3 a.m. waking up and being like, oh, I have to write this down. I can write this. So it was a lengthy application process, but it was also really fun dreaming up this program, saying, wow, I could have funding for this dream that I'm just creating with this host organization to actually go do something really good in my community. So it was also like very fun to do.
Wonderful. I'm going to mention a couple of things that I was finding thematically between the three of you. One is, I don't think anybody yet has mentioned a public interest advisor. So if you have a supportive and good public interest office at your law school, they have often applied for these fellowships with other past students. And I went to UCLA for law school and had a fantastic public interest experience, got to see a few past applications that got funded. That's incredibly instructive in how you draft this, right? And sort of what you see as the scope of the problem that you're framing and the research, because every application has, similar components, but some want you to elaborate more on what the project is actually going to do, or some want you to elaborate more on what the need is in the community. And so, when you're writing these applications, and I'll say that the EJW application is quite lengthy, the Skadden application is, at that time when I applied, was slightly less lengthy. And so just have a sense of take a look at your online applications. I'm sure they're up now for the fall application. So have a sense, if you're thinking about it, it's better just to take a look and see sort of what's going to be expected. And because you want to apply from a really informed place, and your mentors, whether that's at your organization or your public interest office, or in Christina's case at ACS, can help you draft some of that and help you help provide some guidance into the problem that they hope to solve through this project. But ultimately, it is on you, as Christina says. You're the one that's dreaming about the questions you're going to get in the interview round. And one of the things that I think I found really helpful as I was applying is my public interest advisor said, you want to think about it as a triangle. You want to think one side is you, one side is your organization, and one side is your project. And if you think about it, I'm sure definitely, fellowship advisors, whether at EJW or Skadden, have also framed it that way. But I found that really helpful to see if you can connect all three, the project really makes sense to sort of launch. If you're on board, the organization's on board, and the project itself is right. And so as you think about what to propose to an organization, you want to make sure that all three components really have a collaborative and integrative relationship. I was going to talk a little bit about, or ask a little bit about the interview process. Jenny, did you have any kind of interview for this? I know you had some conversations, but and then I'll move over to Ramis and Christina.
Yeah, sorry, before the interviews, if I can just clarify one thing. I think for Justice Catalyst, the calendar moves a little bit later in the academic year, and I think more compressed. So because I only had a year between graduation and when I would start my clerkship, I was only looking at the Justice Catalyst. So that means that my process, including the process of reaching out to potential sponsors, didn't start until I think maybe middle of January. So I spent about maybe a week and a half just having a lot of calls with the sponsor and with community partners to put that application together by the February 15th deadline, I think. So the calendar moves later on, and I think a lot more quickly for the Justice Catalyst Fellowship. In terms of the interview, yes, I did have an interview. It was over Zoom, 30-minute, very casual conversation. At that point, because I'd also involved them in the process of building my project. So Justice Catalyst takes perspecti, I guess, before the fellowship deadline, and they give, I think, actually very generous feedback on that proposal. So by the time that I met with them for an interview, they were actually quite familiar with what I was trying to do. So it was more a conversation kind of about feasibility, maybe follow-up questions they had from our previous conversations, but it was a very casual kind of back and forth between myself and the program director.
Ramis, what about you? What was the interview with Skadden like?
The Skadden interview is I wouldn't say it's pretty intensive, but I think there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that you that you ace the interview. And a lot of like former Skadden fellows that you talk to along the way emphasize that the interview really is like a key piece of the application process. So after you submit your application, there's one round of kind of rejections and kind of moving forward. So I don't know how many people move forward to the interview round, but once you're at the interview round, it's really your first and kind of only interaction with the fellowship selection committee. And so the interviews usually with Kathleen, who's the executive director of the foundation, and with a Skadden partner who's on the one of the partners who are on the selection committee. And so it's kind of the two of them and you. And you have an opportunity to kind of pitch your project, explain why it's important and necessary right now. And then it's kind of, back and forth questions about your project, about you, about your relationship with the organization and the city that you want to go to for about an hour. And, the questions range from very soft behavioral questions as to why you think you'd be a good fit for the foundation, all the way into substantive questions, sometimes getting I got as nitty gritty as, kind of the statutory defenses available to the federal government in Federal Tort Claims Act litigation, which was a piece of my fellowship project. It doesn't usually get that nitty gritty, but it really is just a conversation that you go with the flow wherever it goes. You should be prepared to take it there. So there's a lot of prep that went into it, making sure doctrinally what your project is about, while also being ready to not talk about that at all. So after we found out about that second round in, I think, early October, focus really just shifted for that next month to practicing for the interview.
And Christina, can you elaborate a little bit more about the interview process for EJW?
Yeah, so EJW is a little bit different in that you interview with the entity that is looking at funding your project. So my project was funded by Latham and Watkins. So I interviewed with them and I went into their Houston office, and they had a wall of, like, this was pre-pandemic, but they had a wall of like video chats set up. So that there were attorneys from the San Francisco office and the New York office, and they were all asking me all sorts of questions. And like Ramis said, you should be ready to take soft questions, but you should also be ready for substantive questions, because my interviewers asked me some very detailed questions about the right to counsel and school disciplinary proceedings, and about what tools I would be utilizing in fighting for students. So they even asked me, like, what will you even argue? So say my kid gets expelled, what are you even arguing? Like, aside from due process, what tools do you even have? So definitely be ready for those substantive questions. Make sure you know your subject inside and out, and that you have definitely done the research, but you will have done a lot of this research as part of the application process too. So it's not going to be, something new, but they did ask me some questions that I honestly thought I wouldn't have been prepared for if I hadn't been a teacher before law school, because they asked me some questions that were like very substantive about just public schools in general. So make sure that you are ready to talk about all kinds of things with your fellowship, with your proposal. Make sure that you are ready to talk about anything that you may have even briefly mentioned in your application. So my interview was intense. I was definitely a little bit nervous when I started getting interviewed, just because there were so many people in my interview. But if you are really passionate about a subject, that passion is going to show through. And if it's something, that you care enough about to write such a lengthy application for, that passion is going to show. So even though you may be nervous for interviews, just make sure that I kind of grounded myself in knowing, hey, there's going to be a lot of really wonderful people interviewing today, but no one will be more passionate than I am. They might be as passionate, but I will be, at the most passionate with other people who might be as passionate. No one will be more passionate than me on this subject. So I would just kind of ground yourself in that if you get nervous for the interviews. And also look at your funders for EJW. Look at your funders and look what they have funded in the past, the types of projects they have funded in the past. And also, if you're interviewing with a firm, you'll want to know the people you're interviewing with as if you were interviewing for a law firm job. You'll want to look up their biographies and see if there's anything that you could talk to them specifically about. There were some people in my interview that had done Teach for America, and I also did Teach for America. So I was able to talk to them about that. So now that's specific to EJW, but so it was intense, but it was still, as long as you are ready to talk about everything in your application, you will be fine.
That's all you need. You just need to be ready to talk about everything related to the project, and you're all set. Now, I remember that interview process being really intense. And so finding mentors at your organization, within your law school, past friends who have even interviewed, right? They don't have to have gotten the fellowship, but who can explain to you what you can expect out of that experience. Don't be shy to reach out, certainly to ACS, if you need to be connected to people. Jenny, I was hoping to come back to you and talk a little bit about, it's one thing to get a fellowship, and it's a wonderful opportunity and a great honor, but it's another thing to have a successful fellowship experience. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you hope to accomplish in 1 year, and then also to the other two, sort of what are the deliverables that you work towards, Christina, or Ramis, what you're going to be working towards producing in 2 years. And that'll help, again, with students understanding the scope of the 2-year project timeline and the 2-year project achievements.
Yeah, I think that's a really great but also difficult question, because I think it's increasingly dawning on me that 1 year is an incredibly short amount of time, especially for a project of my project's nature, which is to kind of build trust with the community here, and kind of institute an approach to a workflow that has kind of not been tried before. So if I think were to think about, what I would consider a successful year, I think it would be putting in place an infrastructure for this kind of approach to policymaking in this office. And I think also maybe, you know, hopefully creating this infrastructure in a way that sets up a model for other offices who are similarly situated as well. So I think that's a part of it. As I mentioned, one of the desired work products from this is kind of to come up with the filling for some of the more daring immigration proposals that the Congresswoman has been behind before. So that's kind of, I think, another tangible deliverable. But I think, what I'm envisioning is that there will be a long runway to building trust with the people who've worked in this space for a long time. And it can't just be me kind of going in there and thinking of myself as a disruptor. So, I think it's going to take a long time to kind of build those relationships. And I imagine that will be a pretty significant bulk of that year, and sort of using that as a springboard to build that infrastructure for this sort of approach to policymaking.
Wonderful. Ramis, what about you? What are you hoping to accomplish in 2 years?
Well, even though I'm lucky enough to have twice as much time as Jenny, I am cognizant of the fact that 2 years is not nearly enough for any project, really. I think anyone on this call who has participated in litigation of any form knows that 2 years is just not enough for even a single case. And I think that's actually baked into the application process for fellowships, that you should be very cognizant of the fact that you don't have enough time for anything you propose. And that you should be aware of that. It's going to come up in the interview. You should, preempt it in your application, and that, like, what can I really accomplish in 1 year or 2 years, depending on the fellowship you're applying for, in a way that can set up your successor, set up your community, set up your organization to take kind of the building blocks that you set up forward. And really carry that project on. So a lot of my project has to do with ensuring that immigrant neighborhoods in Detroit, and especially further out from city centers, have the tools and resources to know kind of just like what to do when an ICE officer, a Border Patrol officer, or even a local cop is terrorizing their neighborhood in some way. Whether that's through local accountability processes, the State Civil Rights Commission, federal tort claims, what do you do in that situation? And I think that's one thing that is realistic to set up in 2 years, is to kind of just build capacity and build an understanding of what the mechanics are for these processes, so that even when I'm gone in 2 years, or when I finish my fellowship in 2 years, there will be kind of infrastructure set up that my partner organizations and other community organizations that I work with can still use after the duration of the fellowship. So as long as there's something left after the fellowship, the litigation, I'm confident that the ACLU can take forward, whether or not I'm there after the fellowship. What I care about more is building the infrastructure for organizations that wouldn't otherwise have the resources to carry forward a project like this themselves. So as long as that can happen in 2 years, then I'm satisfied.
Wonderful. And Christina, what about you? I was hoping you could talk a little bit about reporting requirements that some fellowships often have in terms of a 6-month report or a 12-month report. I know at the time that I did my EJW, we had an annual report. So it was just once a year, you would write some feedback to your funder. I also was funded by a law firm, just sending them an update about what the process has been like. And if you wanted to secure some additional funding at that time, that was available. So you could say, hey, I need funding for X, Y, and Z. would you be able to, increase my fellowship to this much? And we were lucky to get that. So could you talk a little bit about the reporting and then also what you did accomplish in 2 years?
Yeah, so EJW requires reports every 6 months. So we submitted extensive reports every 6 months that included both qualitative and quantitative information. They asked for information about the number of clients you had represented, and then they asked for information about specific stories. So they were also looking for stories for your funder, but I had a unique situation in that my funder was very involved in my project. I worked with them all the time, and I visited Latham and Watkins' office all the time and gave presentations to their office and worked on a number of pro bono cases with them. So we were in contact all the time, but it was still good for them, I think, to have those 6-month reports. And sometimes they would mention things that they had seen in those 6-month reports. Every 6 months, you do have those reporting requirements. And what I did is I tracked some of the information that I knew they would be asking for. So throughout my entire fellowship, I kept an Excel spreadsheet where I tracked demographic information of my clients because I knew that that was information they would be asking for. So I had that information at the ready every 6 months. And I kept, track of all of my clients and what zip codes they were in. Just a lot of data. I kept a lot of data to kind of track our effectiveness and see where we needed to expand the program. And as far as deliverables, there were a number of things. Since my project was not litigation and it was direct services in administrative proceedings that have a pretty quick turnaround, we were able to get a lot of concrete things done because those cases were a lot quicker, obviously, than if you're in federal court. So the deliverables were the number of clients we served, but then also there were some other things. I did a Know Your Rights kit. I partnered with some other organizations because there's just a gap of information on what your rights are as a student in school disciplinary proceedings. And that was an actual deliverable that I could send to EJW and that I could send to my funder and say, here, now you can see this kit is online and this will stay here after my fellowship. And there's ways for it to be updated as the Texas Education Code changes. And then one other deliverable was that I started a clinic at the law school, a clinic course called the the Education Rights Clinic, not Texas Education Rights Clinic. And I had some law students who were representing kids in school disciplinary proceedings, and that has continued. It's just being taught by someone else because I'm clerking in a federal clerkship and I can't teach it right now. So that will continue moving forward. So they have students this semester, they will have students next semester, and setting up that infrastructure, like Ramis talked about, setting up that infrastructure so that someone else can continue that work, because 2 years is just such a short amount of time to even build trust in a community, to get people to trust you and know that you're really there for them, and to get them to call you when bad things are happening, particularly in communities where people have been traditionally marginalized and they don't trust people coming in, especially as a white woman, like going into communities of color. Being able to build those relationships takes a very long time, and understandably so. So 2 years is a short time, but if you can focus on those deliverable things, it's very context specific to your project, but building that infrastructure and then having some things that will stay once you're gone, like know your rights information, or anything like that, it still makes a difference, even though you only have those 2 years to address specific problems.
Wonderful. I want to highlight one thing that each of you talked about, which is just collaboration between not just your host organization, but other entities within the community. So that can be government agencies, that can also be other nonprofits that would benefit from your work or can help enhance your work. Projects that build a web of connections are always projects that foundations like to sponsor, just because you're not just helping one big fish, you're helping a lot of capacity building in some of the smaller fishes as well. And it shows the interconnected nature of any kind of social justice work or movements. And so as you think about your work, don't think about it just as, tunnel visioned for one particular organization. Try to bring in collaborators, because one of the things we haven't talked about is, you know, besides just a project, you have to submit a personal statement, you have to submit letters of recommendation. And so all of this generally should be sort of timed out, which is why I really recommend looking at the fellowship applications now and just getting a sense of, okay, what am I going to, if I'm going to do this, what do I have to assemble to put forth a valiant effort for this, right? Because you don't want to write a 15-page application in 2 days at the very end, because you know it's taxing just as it is, and it also shows up in when these funders ask you these really deep questions about, well, why do you want to do the work? Why are you the right person? How does this law implicate this community? And so the last question I want to end on, and I know I have to leave some room for audience questions too, is Jenny, you're going to a clerkship. Christina, you're in a clerkship. Ramis, are you wanting to, what do you think you're going to be doing? And for Jenny and Christina, you know, is this kind of work what you're going to be continuing to do after your clerkships are over? So basically, like, what do you plan to do beyond just the fellowship?
Yeah, so, you know, I think right now I am exiting law school with a bunch of interests, not just in terms of issue areas, but also in terms of the mode of work. So, you know, I think law school has given me the highest level of exposure just in terms of the clinics that I did and the classes that I took to litigation work, which I really love, and which is why I applied to Clerk, to keep that option open. But wanted to use that year in the middle to try something that I haven't done before, which is policy work. I think in the future, I am interested in returning to local government, which is where I spent some time before law school and during law school. And I envision that, you know, this 1-year experience and also my clerkships will kind of provide me with a bunch of options for participating in local government work after, you know, the 3 years have gone by, whether that be in a policy capacity or like a legal counsel capacity or a litigation capacity.
Wonderful. Ramis, how about you?
Well, I'm not clerking after the fellowship. I am hoping to stay in Detroit, which is, I'm from the area, and you know, it's I've been trying to come back here for a while. So I'm just hoping to stay in Detroit in the civil rights space. There are a handful of organizations here that do kind of public interest legal work, movement lawyering, racial justice work, and I'm hoping to land, you know, at one of those organizations.
What about you, Christina?
Yeah, so I am finishing my clerkship in 2 months. And then I am headed to the Harris County Attorney's Office. I'll be in their affirmative litigation section. And that job I actually also got through an ACS friend. So reminder to everyone to stay in touch with all your ACS friends. And I'll be doing litigation on election law, consumer protection, environmental issues. So just a variety of different public interest things. But the reason that I am switching and not going back to representation in school disciplinary proceedings is because by the end of the 2 years, it was very clear to me that some of these things are not going to change unless school districts are sued. And organizing can only change so many things in places where racist ideas are entrenched, and they are not going anywhere without litigation. So the program is continuing. There is someone who's still doing school discipline representation, but I, especially towards the end of my fellowship, saw that we had one case in particular where I co-counseled with LDF and the ACLU of Texas, and I really saw, okay, I need these tools to really affect some of these things that are keeping me up at night. So that is why I'm switching to a public interest litigation role.
Wonderful. Moving on to some of the questions. Someone asked about grades. How significant was that in the application being accepted? Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
I believe that I did not even submit my transcript to Justice Catalyst.
Did either of you submit transcripts? I can't remember if I did or not. I have no memory.
I did not, I don't think. And I think there wasn't even GPA on the application. And I know EJW does not look at grades like that because I was an alumni reviewing applications last year and I didn't see anyone's grades whenever they were applying. And I have some friends who did EJW fellowships who I know did not have such stellar grades or did not, have whatever with law school grades. And they ended up at EJW still. So definitely for EJW, it is not a big indicator.
Yeah, I think I submitted like a screenshot of my transcript or like the classes that I was in. It never came up, and I don't think it plays any role in the application process. I think at most, like the words on your transcript matter more than letters, like what classes you've taken, what clinics you're in, and all that. And if you've demonstrated an interest in kind of the area that your project lies within, I think that's the most it can do. Otherwise, it didn't play a role at all.
Wonderful. One of the questions is, does anyone have experience going to an organization you'd like to work for and asking about what projects that they might need? I think each of you spoke to that. I think, as you, and I can sort of take this one, as you think about, okay, I'm interested in juvenile justice, I would really just map it out. Who are the organizations in your area that are doing this kind of work? What kind of relationships do you have with them? Have you summered there? Do you know somebody that works there? Do you have a professor that has a connection there? And then starting the hustle. So starting to meet with people at one or two organizations to see what kind of work would be helpful to them. Have they already secured a fellow? And just know that not getting this does not mean that you don't get to do the work. This is a very competitive process, but there are skilled social justice lawyers and public interest lawyers who never even saw an Equal Justice Works or Skadden application. And so this is but one avenue. And I think sometimes when you're graduating, you think, okay, this is the only way that I can get in the door. And it's true, it is one pathway to an entry-level position at a nonprofit. But it's not the only way. So really think about sort of how you want to approach the process. And if you're not finding a match, there might be, we did not really talk about sort of many law schools now have internally funded fellowships. And so you don't even need to go outside and find a funder. Many of them have, one or two fellowships that are funded by law school donors who, sponsor a fellow for 1 or 2 years at a social justice organization. So think of this in the broad view. I know we have Skadden and EJW and Soros get the most attention, of course. And the other question, anybody else want to add anything to that?
I'll just add one thing, which is you should just cold email people if you're interested in specific organizations, because public interest people, for the large part, are just really lovely people who care about the same things that you do. So you can cold email people and you will be surprised by how many people will say, let's sit down for coffee and talk about all the things that you want to do, because I also care about these things and I want to mentor young lawyers in this space. So just if you have a particular interest, cold email those organizations.
Love that. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on quickly and say that I think the best advice that I got actually from a former Justice Catalyst fellow when I was putting together my application was that, you can't act like either, whether in the proposal or in the interview or in your conversations with other people, that you are doing this for the first time, because whatever you choose to do, there's always going to be a network of organizations and people who've been working in this space and kind of, laying it down brick by brick. So you never want to act like you're the first person doing the work. And I think in that vein, I really like the posture of the question, I think, which was, whether you've ever approached an organization and asked what they need. I always thought that, this fellowships process is a little funny because there's so much work to be done. I don't think it's necessarily the case that you should come up with something on your own. So, I think it's always great to think about what you want to do, research the actors and the players in that space, and then ask what they need, what kind of work they need done. I actually think that that's one of the best approaches to navigating this process.
Agreed. The last question, and feel free if we have time for maybe one more question, or one or two, depending on sort of audience participation, was, that Skadden is only for T14s, but can you speak of the likelihood of fellowships for those of us that are not at Yale, for example? I will say that having done a lot of public interest advising, there's some truth in that, but there's also, I know that Skadden and EJW are likely to fund law schools that have never been funded, students from law schools that have never been funded, because that expands their network, right? And so if your law school's never had a Skadden or an EJW fellow, I think in some ways you highlight a gap there. And so I would use that to your advantage and find the relevant people. I think it's more about, specifically for Skadden, who you know, and obviously your project, but also, if you know of previous Skadden fellows who can advise you, provide guidance. But I wouldn't let that be the limiting factor in terms of where you go to law school. So I was going to see if anybody else had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll add. So, like Aparna mentioned, there's definitely 100% like truth to this statement that like Skadden specifically, but also just public interest fellowships in general, are only for like the most prestigious law schools and applicants. I the trend I've seen over the last few years is that's luckily like a good thing is that that's changing. It's definitely not as good as it can be. My class of Skadden fellows, for example, is around, I think just over half are from top 14 schools. There's only one from Yale, but at the same time, there's like, I don't know, like 8 or 9, like a ridiculous amount from Harvard. So it's definitely like a huge problem still. And it's kind of a nonsensical like trend that, there are 8 or 9, maybe 10 even in some years from a single school. And that's all to say that there's definitely room for any type of applicant. And what I saw from my 1 year of applying to fellowships is that my background, coming from an immigrant neighborhood in Detroit, and the project that I proposed, and the kind of experience that I had in the community and working with the community organizations that I plan to work with, went much further than where I interned, what school I went to, and all of that. So that's all to say, like, it's definitely a problem trend, that public interest fellowships are known to be like reserved for the top schools, but it's definitely not prohibitive in any way. Like, there's no cutoff, soft or hard, like formal or informal.
And EJW does not have the reputation quite of Skadden of being as focused on where people went to school. I mean, I saw EJW fellows funded in Lone Star Legal Aid, which is our local legal aid, who were from South Texas College of Law, which is ranked like 120 or something. So you can definitely still apply, particularly for both. You should apply to anything, regardless of where you've gone to school. And I did not go to Yale. I went to University of Houston, and I did not feel like that was a hindrance at all in my application. So I think what Ramis said about being able to play up your background and why you are the person who should be working on this, and your connection to either the communities that you'll be serving or the type of work that you'll be doing, that is what matters most.
Wonderful. If there's no further questions, if anybody wants to give a last word of advice before we close, I'm sure the students would welcome that. If there's things that we haven't covered, or things that you want to make sure that students think about, please unmute and share if there's something that we missed in our conversation.
I'll go first. I think maybe the first thing is that it's all going to work out. I mean, if you look in my case, I had a couple of personal things come up in the fall semester, couldn't even start looking until January. And I consider myself very lucky, but it worked out in the end. And I think one of the things that I learned from this this process, which ended up being quite short for me, was the importance of, like Christina said, cold emailing in the field that you're interested in, just talking to a bunch of people to get a good feel for what is actually needed and necessary in that line of work and in the community that you're trying to serve. And, you know, not being afraid to really build a project, you know, whether it's something that the host had suggested that they need or something that you want to pursue with the host, not being afraid to really build it in collaboration with the people who are sponsoring you, with people who are going to be involved in your work during your fellowship year. And also, you know, in the case of Justice Catalyst, I'm not sure how it works for Skadden or Equal Justice Works, building it with the people who are going to be reading your application. They are very, very responsive when it comes to feedback. As can be, I think, you know, the fellowship director at your school. I remember having a bunch of calls with her as well. So not being afraid to reach out for help and for feedback, for ideas, you know, for just becoming an expert at you know, what the community and what that line of work needs.
I'll just say two quick things. One is that during this fellowship panel, I got an email and a listserv I'm in that the ACLU Nationals Immigrant Rights Project's fellowship posting is up now. So they're kind of known as one of the earlier movers in this process. So if that's any indication that the fellowship process has started this year, then you know, that should be enough for you to take a look. If you're interested in immigrants' rights, then you know by all means take a look at that fellowship posting. I'll just emphasize again, like, you know, what Jenny said, and you know what Christina and Aparna have mentioned many times during this fellowship panels, just like the importance of collaboration, not only with your host organization, but with, you know, community members, leaders, and organizations as well, especially if you are planning on going to a city that you don't have a personal connection to or experience working in. You know, luckily, I part of my project was about coming home, but I also spoke with, I think, 7 community organizations in addition to my host organization throughout the process of drafting my Skadden Fellowship application. And those conversations, kind of just understanding where my interests could fit their needs, and where the ACLU's resources could supplement theirs. That was probably the most helpful process in helping me develop my application. And now, you know, I have the opportunity to like work with the organizations that I spoke with. So just, you know, emphasizing just close collaboration with every little piece of the process, your host org, community orgs, the fellowship foundation itself. You know, I spoke with the Skadden Foundation folks a number of times throughout the process with any, you know, little question I had. And like Jenny said, like they're incredibly responsive. So yeah, any piece of the process, just definitely don't be afraid to over communicate.
And I'll say 2 quick things. I just want to echo what everyone has said about collaboration. Make sure that you reach out to people, because no good social justice work is done in a vacuum. And there are already organizations addressing the issues that you care about, even if they're not addressing the specific discrete issue that you're wanting to work on. And then I also want to say, feel free to reach out to like, I'm sure I don't want to speak for anyone, but I'm sure everyone on this call would talk to you also. So if you want to talk to anyone and say, hey, you know, I want to learn more, or hey, can you talk me through something? People in this space love to help other people in this space, because everyone in this space is someone who likes to help people. So, you know, feel free to use those resources and reach out to ACS, and just know that there's a lot of people who will be rooting for you, because it's not like in other spaces in law where, you know, it is competitive, but everyone wants you to succeed in this space because your success means something good for your community. So feel free to like reach out to people on this call and your networks with ACS. for mentorship, even for a mock interview. If you get an interview and you want someone to do a mock interview, I've done that for several people who were interviewing with EJW. And someone did it for me. Just know that like we got that help too. No one succeeds alone. It takes communities to help individual lawyers succeed too. So make sure to reach out to people. Most people will be very happy to talk to you.
Well, wonderful. I hope it's a webinar, so we can't see you guys, but I hope you'll join me in thanking our fantastic panelists. I am so thrilled that the next generation of public interest lawyers is really going to change the world in lots of different spaces, and excited to follow your projects. And, you know, as Christina said, don't be a stranger, reach out to ACS or any of us. And, you know, look forward to more conversations on this topic from the ACS Career Series too. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Bridget now.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I want to remind you that registration is open for our national convention, and do reach out to our panelists. It is a huge opportunity for you to get feedback, and you can also reach out to your chapter's affiliate or any chapter board members that you know and connect with us. I will also put my email in the chat if you need a chapter's director to contact, and we will get you in contact with our clerkship department. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good week.